Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. Today's episode will continue last week's conversation about BMI and gender-affirming surgeries. My guest today is Elijah Castle. Together, we cover some language that people can expect to hear in the weeks ahead as we both attend the US PATH conference beginning today and debriefing how it goes. Elijah reviews some of the research of BMI and surgeries, how BMI gets reinforced as a justifiable tool to use when telling trans people they can or cannot get gender-affirming surgery. And we wrap up with what we'll be listening for as we attend the conference. But first, some good news. This morning, I was interviewed by Vicky Gonzalez-Bartel at Capital Public Radio Studios in Sacramento about my experience with and analysis of ultra-processed foods. She asked great questions about how nutrition narratives can contribute to shame for some people, and who the messages about only eating unprocessed foods are for. Shout out to Vicky, a fan and friend of the podcast, for the interview. I can officially say that one news outlet has covered this story. A link to the story will be in the show notes. Now, on to my interview with Elijah Castle. He's the study coordinator at the Hunter Alliance for Research and Translation at Hunter College. Previously, he worked in the gender-affirming surgery at NYU Langone as a research coordinator and at Callan Lord Community Health Center as a medical case manager in the Health Outreach to Teens program. He has also done graduate coursework in bioethics at the NY School of Global Public Health. For over 5 years, he's provided peer and community support and education on topics related to trans healthcare and surgery navigation, especially genital surgeries. Here's our interview. Elijah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I asked you on, this will come out the first day, so the Wednesday of the US PATH conference. So you and I will be meeting up in person the day after this comes out. I will be sitting in on Surgeon's Day, number one, probably at the neurodivergence and trans care, and then praying that I know somebody who will show up the next day to rescue me. So I'm already looking forward to meeting you. I asked you on to go through some terms, some things that, I'll be looking for, you'll be looking for as we put together like all of the things that we're learning at the conference, and then stuff that I'm going to share. So this will be like a little primer for people who want to follow along and like keep up with, words and terms that we're using, especially when it comes to gender-affirming surgery.
Sounds good.
Let's start with some surgical terms and any research terms, surgery names. I know it would be helpful for some people because a lot of people just don't know which surgery options are available to folks. So what do you think it would be helpful and important for people to hear?
Yeah, I think I don't know how often you talk about if you have defined like what BMI is already. But I think even if like people are just picking this up and haven't listened previously, I can go over like BMI because that's pretty pertinent to like what we're talking about. So BMI is also like body mass index. It's calculated by dividing body mass by the square of body height. So it's used pretty ubiquitously throughout clinical settings as well as in medical literature as a proxy for body fat percentage or distribution and as a health metric to evaluate like people's health. And it's also used as a means to set thresholds for who is an appropriate candidate for certain surgical procedures. So this is often true mostly in like elective surgeries, which are surgeries that are not needed like imminently to save someone's life in that moment, as compared with something like surgery after some kind of physical trauma where someone needs like a surgery right at that moment to save their life. So examples of elective surgeries where BMI thresholds are used include like hip and knee surgeries or like a tonsillectomy or a hernia repair. And also includes the focus of what we're talking about here, which are gender-affirming surgeries. So BMI thresholds in gender-affirming surgery will vary based on the procedure, but often like 30 to 35 BMI is where the line is drawn. So someone above a 30 to 35 BMI may be told that they need to lose weight before they'll be allowed to have surgery. Usually people will like justify BMI thresholds as a means to protect patients from adverse outcomes that are assumed to come along with high BMI. Not all surgeons have BMI thresholds, and some of them will look at other factors instead of or in addition to BMI, like what the surgery is. the patient's body composition and fat distribution and like overall health status, including whether or not they have any chronic conditions like diabetes. So yeah, I think like knowing what BMI is and kind of how it's used in gender affirming surgery is helpful. I think also what gender affirming surgery is helpful. Gender affirming surgeries are really a category that include lots of different surgeries. So like chest and breast surgeries, genital surgeries, facial surgeries, reproductive system surgeries, and so on. Often we talk about gender affirming surgeries in the context of trans people undergoing these surgeries, but I like to clarify that it's not only trans people who undergo gender affirming surgeries. Things like breast augmentation or vaginoplasty or facial surgery. These are all surgeries that cis people or non-trans people also undergo. Now, for trans people, the barriers to surgery are often increased due in part to systemic institutional transphobia, where there are requirements for mental health assessments and so on. So then BMI thresholds just like compound with these other barriers. I think lastly, in terms of like terminology and language to know, I want to say something also about surgical complications. When people talk about complications, they'll commonly talk about like complications and will not be more specific than that. But complications are really an umbrella term, and complications can actually involve like a number of different things. So like a complication can be an infection, it can be a hematoma or a seroma. So like, lots of blood or like an internal like kind of bruising, or like a fluid collection. And complications are like things that may happen, but are not like the intentional outcome of the surgery. But again, often when we talk about complications, we're just talking about them as like complications as this like nebulous kind of thing. And I think being specific is important because complications can vary in terms of like the severity of the complication and the intervention that is needed to resolve the complication. Sometimes a complication can be resolved just through like waiting for it to heal. And sometimes someone needs like a whole nother surgery to fix a complication. And the ways in which surgical complications are reported is not standardized in gender affirming surgery, meaning that even when publishing data on the same surgery, not all complications will be defined in the same way or reported at all. So this means also that we can't effectively like compare outcomes from different studies because they don't include the same types of data, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Some people didn't know or couldn't tell that you were using complications in quotation marks at one point. So I'll just throw that out there. And I hear the same about outcomes, like and I put that one in air quotes as well. Like, can you define outcomes for me? What does that look like? Why are you, gatekeeping surgery based on like nebulous outcomes?
Right.
So yes, just definitely affirming that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because outcomes could be like, is it the kind of aesthetic or the cosmetic or the visual outcome that we're talking about that BMI may potentially affect or interact with? Are we talking about outcomes on someone's health? It is, yes, using outcomes as an umbrella term is also nebulous. And I think that when we talk about things like complications and outcomes, it's helpful to be more specific about what we're actually talking about.
So since you are a researcher in this capacity, what does the available research tell us about weight stigma and BMI gatekeeping and gender affirming surgeries?
So first, we know that generally speaking about BMI, its use as a health metric is flawed because it was never intended to be used with regards to individual health status. BMI was created in the 19th century to measure the body size distribution of the average man at a macro level. So at the time, data was collected only from like cisgender European men. And it wasn't until the 20th century that BMI was used as an individual metric of health. First for the purpose of like calculating life insurance premiums, and then later as a measure of cardiovascular risk. So because BMI was created using data from white cis European men, it's not actually validated for use in non-white and non-cis populations. With that being said, BMI is used in a lot of like medical and surgical literature. So we can look then at what does the surgical literature say about patients with high BMIs. The literature says that patients with high BMIs have an increased risk of surgical complications like surgical site infection. It is also, from the literature, more difficult to anesthetize fat people. Surgeries usually take longer, so there's a longer operative time, and surgeries are also more like technically difficult to perform. Now, I think the latter two can kind of be explained by lack of practice and lack of technical innovation. So there was a study that came out this year that surveyed plastic surgeons' knowledge and attitudes around performing breast surgeries, not necessarily gender affirming, also included gender affirming surgeries in patients with high BMIs. The majority of the surgeons who responded to the survey had less training and less experience performing breast and chest surgeries on patients with high BMIs. But they actually didn't indicate any concern about the lack of training that they had for operating on fat patients. I would guess that this, outcomes, when we're talking about outcomes and potentially negative outcomes associated with high BMI for surgery, a lot of that is attributed to just like body size and fatness being bad and leading to bad health outcomes and just being bad for health generally. But if surgeons have less practice and less experience operating on fat patients, I would guess, I haven't seen data specifically connecting these two, but I would guess that that has something to do with it. Because if you don't have a lot of practice doing something, you're probably not going to be that great at doing it. And so, unless someone is a bariatric surgeon, it's unlikely that the majority of their patients are going to be fat. So, of course, surgery is going to be more difficult when you're operating on someone with a body that's less familiar to you. And so, again, when we look at outcomes that are associated with high BMI or fatness, often it's extrapolated to mean that something is wrong with the patient. And I don't believe that should be the case. But most commonly, going to complications again, when people talk about risks of surgery for fat patients, they'll mostly discuss increased complication risk. There is something called the obesity paradox used to describe the observation that people who have a BMI between 25 to 39.9, which are considered clinically overweight and obese categories, sometimes have better outcomes than those with normal BMIs. And I'm using the words because those are like the BMI categories, not because I like using those words, but just for ease of understanding. So obesity paradox, people who have like clinically overweight or obese BMIs have better outcomes than people with normal BMIs, quote unquote, even though most of us would assume and are often told that people with a normal or even underweight BMI would have the lowest odds for poor outcomes. In gender affirming specifically, the risk of complications depend on the type of surgery and body composition, in addition to what the data says about outcomes associated with higher BMIs. But we don't have a lot of evidence around gender affirming surgery and BMI with regard to complications and outcomes. There is more data on gender affirming mastectomy or top surgery than we do for other surgeries, especially genital surgeries. The data largely says that top surgery is safe and that there is not an increased risk of complications for patients with like a BMI of 30 to 39.9. The median BMI reported in the literature for genital surgeries, though, is not higher than 30. So we really don't have a lot of like robust data for people who are having genital surgeries and have higher BMIs. So often then like surgeons and researchers will extrapolate from similar procedures, like other surgeries that happen in the pelvic region, or for like chest and breast surgeries, we'll look at other non-gender affirming surgeries that take place in that region of the body to make assumptions about risks and outcomes. But we are really limited to only making assumptions like this when we don't have robust data. There's a few reasons why we have such limited data. Like before I said, a lot of surgeons are just not operating on fat people because BMI thresholds exist. Surgeons who operate on fat patients also may not just be like publishing their outcomes. It could be because of concern around like publishing outcomes data that may not be aligned with like what they want to be publishing. So that's one thing.
Can I ask you to speak a bit more to that one?
There's two pieces with this, and one of them is the what outcomes are surgeons sharing. Then the visibility piece also has to do with the photos that they're sharing on their websites, if they're open to sharing those. And I think that when we talk in community about people who are looking at surgeons to go to and looking at photos of people's bodies after they've had surgery so that they can help set realistic expectations for themselves, it's often hard for people who have like non-normative body types to find photos that are representative of their body type. So fat people, Black people, and people of color often have a harder time finding those photos. And that's because surgeons can cherry pick the photos that they're sharing. Normative and conventionally attractive body types are what are just conventionally most desirable. And so those are what surgeons are going to, just broadly speaking, want to share because those are like more like attractive body types, normatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in terms of the visual outcomes that surgeons are sharing. On the part of surgical outcomes and complication rates that are being published, people's names are always attached to the data that they're publishing. And so if someone is perhaps open to publishing their data, but the association between BMI and high BMI and poor surgical outcomes is true, and that they have worse outcomes when they're operating on fat patients, regardless of like what that actual mechanism or what the cause of that is. It may be, this is me hypothesizing, because I don't want to claim that surgeons are not publishing their data for whatever reasons, but I would guess that if someone is having worse outcomes, they may not want to publish that data because then it's associated with their name. It's also the case that not all surgeons are also publishing research. Some of surgeons, especially those who don't work in academic medical institutions and just have a private practice, may be focused on the clinical side of their practice. So even if they are operating on lots of fat patients and those fat patients are having positive outcomes or whatever outcomes they're having, it may just not be published because they're not a researcher and they don't care to publish their data. So that's also just because not all surgeons are also doing research. We just are missing that data. There are sometimes you can pull from like databases of patients who are on Medicaid, and you can sometimes get some of their data that's associated with that. It's generally de-identified data, but those are data sets that can be analyzed, but those are also limited in terms of this is a specific subset of the population of people who are having surgery because they are on Medicaid. So then you're missing out on patients who are paying for surgery out of pocket or who are using other insurance plans to cover their surgeries.
That's all interesting to think about. The publishing piece should have been obvious to me, but that one I'm just thinking about right now. And when I have asked surgery centers, specifically in the Bay Area, about how they identify outcomes, a lot of them will talk about things that me and my, colleagues in like college health or otherwise would refer to as nursing problems. So, there's one surgery center that won't actually take people with a BMI below 18.5 because of their experience with bed sores. And it's like, that's something that, many people, especially older people, experience. And there are ways, that we can support those people. Or there's concerns with like vaginoplasty that people won't be able to dilate the new canal, right? And like, that's like something that people need support with. A lot of these like quote outcomes to me seem easily, either prevented or solvable. So it's always, interesting for me when people are like complications. I'm like, is it because of the person? Is it because of their BMI? Or, is it a situational, concern that can be easily solved with support?
Yeah, it's just a lot of the time a lack of like structural support and resources for people who are less privileged, or just also the intersection with what you're talking about with like dilation after vaginoplasty and concern around patients being able to dilate. I've heard surgeons say that they are concerned that fat patients won't be able to like reach their genitals to clean them, and that they also will not be able to, reach and dilate. And it's interesting to bring this up as something that, then the claim that weight loss will resolve these concerns potentially. But there are also people who have limited mobility if they're disabled or if they're older. I'm presenting at USPath on gender affirming, like considerations for gender affirming surgery for older adults. And this is something that also like we think about, but don't really have data on with regards to like thinking about how many people would potentially want to get surgery, but can't because there's not really support for people who can't dilate because of the reasons we're talking about. And this is something that I feel like similarly with BMI thresholds and concerns around operating on fat people, part of which, or the other limitations that patients face is just like lack of appropriate equipment, like operating tables that will support people at higher weights and longer tools. These are all things that can like, we can make tools. I'm not an engineer. And I don't like make tools, but I
Sure.
assume like we have many innovations in many different areas of the world. And I would assume that there are things that we can innovate in this way to help support like surgeons who are operating on fat patients, so that it is easier and safer, and also to support patients who don't have full mobility or can't reach parts of their body for whatever reason, so that they can still take care of themselves.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that, especially with conventionally beautiful people who may have mobility, issues, that surgeons would have no problem supporting that person and even putting them on, their website as a positive outcome. And I'm like, come on, people, like we see what's happening here. Your anti-fatness is showing right through. The surgeons like themselves will do not all surgeons, of course, but often to me seem, as someone who is not trans, as like the savior type of people for the ones who are cis, especially like the cis gays come in, and like the way they speak about the trans people, and the work that they're doing and the way that they're presenting, and just like, I am doing God's work up here. It's just so patronizing, so weird, so demeaning, so not what needs to be happening. I don't know if that's your experience, particularly with the cis surgeons.
Yeah, it's hard to navigate because I respect what surgeons do a lot. They do very, very important jobs, and like we need them because they do surgery that is important.
Sure.
And also I think a lot of the attitudes that surgeons have are because of the like medical industry and medical like education, and just how medicine is structured in terms of like doctors and surgeons. It's really, they can't be wrong because that means that they're doing their job poorly, and that the stakes are very, very high. So admitting that they are wrong is like dangerous and like can put themselves at risk. And so I think that can lead to then this kind of like savior complex that you're talking about, because of the like desire to always be right and the desire to really help people. And I think like a lot of it comes from a very well-intentioned place, but I think also we all are in our own little like corners of like what we do, and like surgeons are in like medicine and surgery, and then there are other people who are doing surgery adjacent work but are not necessarily surgeons. And I think that, I mean, obviously I have a bias because I work in surgical research and surgery adjacent research, but I'm not a surgeon. So I guess take this with a grain of salt and as you will, but it does feel like there's a privileging of like being a surgeon and having an MD after your name in terms of like the legitimacy of your work, and also who is picked for like plenary sessions or keynote speakers at conferences. And I think also it kind of shows in, I don't always love to like slot trans people into the like, we are underprivileged and have lack of access to like higher education and like generally have like lower income, because I think that is a broad generalization, and at least doesn't like I'm college educated. I have some graduate studies. Like I'm not low income. So that doesn't speak to my own experience. But I think it does show when we're looking broadly at like who are the people who are featured to like have these, to be on like podiums and to be featured speaking. And I think that trans health care and trans health research and all of this work is like replicates kind of the like structural stigma of society more broadly. Because I think also the last thing I'll say on this topic, because this is an interesting topic to me and I have lots of thoughts on it, is that a lot of what is talked about as being like new or novel research or things that are happening in the field are things that the community has been doing for many, many years for ourselves. And it just hasn't been published on or widely available because of lots of reasons, like transphobia and like lack of focus on trans people. And then there is a trend that I see happening where things will be talked about at conferences as though they are novel creations by a singular person that actually feel like they are, even if the person who's talking about this thing doesn't actually know that the community has already like done this and talked about it at length. There's a lack of like, I think, community engagement where then people can find this out and collaborate with people in the community, whether they are community members or also professionals in the field, which I think that kind of collaboration is really important and helpful so that we can like continue to like build on what already exists instead of coming up with an idea, thinking it's a novel idea, and then just talking about it without that community engagement. Because then you're missing that other piece of the work that has been happening for years and years.
Yeah. That's really important. Thanks for sharing that. Let's skip ahead to what you and I are looking for, looking to hear, looking to see at USPath.
Yeah. I'm interested to see what discussions happen about BMI thresholds. I know that the first plenary session on the first day of USPath, that's not Surgeon's Day, is on BMI thresholds. And I'm interested to see like what the speakers at the plenary session will be talking about and like what I guess updates they have to share. It seems to me that surgeons have been trending toward not having BMI thresholds or having like higher thresholds for top surgery, but that is not the case with like genital surgery. I would love to see if people talk about like the effects of preoperative weight loss on postoperative outcomes, especially if people lose weight before surgery and then regain it after. Like, what does that do to their outcomes? We don't really have any data that talks about that. And I think that's a really important piece, especially with, I think more and more commonly, people are using weight loss medications to lose weight before surgery and then may go off them after. I'm also curious to see how often weight loss medications are discussed generally, because I think people kind of see this as them as like this magical thing that is like, we found the solution. Like, we just need to get people on these weight loss medications and they can get surgery. But that doesn't take into consideration, like, how long do you expect people to be on these medications? What happens when they go off them after surgery and so on?
In that same theme, I'm looking to see how closely people will connect eating disorders and BMI. So, in my experience, people will be like, trans and non-binary folks have more eating disorders, and that's really sad, and we don't like that, and malnourishment is a concern. Next sentence, and we need people to lose weight for surgery. And I've asked, like, what's this connection here? Hello, like, are you worried about malnourishment? And no, not at all. I'm also looking for the things that are unsaid. At the Trans Health Summit, there was a surgeon who was just defending his use of BMI because BMI just tells us so much, about a patient, their blood sugar, their blood pressure, whether or not they're housed, their socioeconomic status, and on and on. And I both like lost it and like roared like to engagement in that, moment. And like, I'm writing things down furiously. And I'm like, what is happening? I know what you're saying, surgeon. And wow, you just said the quiet part out loud. You just said that that you think all fat people, have high blood sugar, are unhoused, don't have money, don't have support, all of these things like that. Do you realize that you said that out loud? Is how I felt in that moment. And also, of course you did. Like, at the same time, yes, we know that you think that to be true. So I'm looking to see, what other things are said, or if that is reinforced, or what else they're using. They're using BMI as code for. And then, of course, I'm looking to see who will talk to me about their beliefs and stand in, their anti-fatness, their anti-blackness, and everything else. And we'll see.
Yeah, on that note, it'll be interesting to see if people do make the direct connection with, I don't know that it'll be referred to as anti-fatness, but with BMI or just generally talking about fat patients and that being associated with anti-blackness and race. Because I think that when we think about like ideal outcomes, quote unquote, and that being generally like white, thin people, and people who are like most kind of cis passing, that it is like skinny white people who are seen as like being the ideal candidates and having the ideal surgical outcomes. And I think that there's not like explicit acknowledgement of the fact that desirability plays into all of this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think about pretty privilege a lot also here, especially among the surgeons and how they make basically their own choices.
Yeah, and it seems to be the case that plastic surgeons are the ones who have the most, for like elective surgeries, have the most stringent preoperative requirements in terms of like BMI, nicotine cessation, and so on. And plastic surgeons are the ones who are often doing things that will like largely affect what people look like. But because of society's ideals about like what is attractive or not, I think largely like plastic surgeons generally hold conventional ideas of like what is attractive. I think it's just interesting, like who has the power in the situation and who is deciding like what people with what bodies are getting surgeries. And a lot of it just plays into the power dynamics of society and so on.
I feel like this was amazing and a great primer. And I know that a lot of folks who are interested in particularly the research, like a lot of this conversation is like the backstory that many people, including, myself when getting into the field, like come in and think that everything is with good intention. And that's actually not the case. So this is a great primer going into this conference. I cannot wait to meet you. I cannot wait to see other people there who are, asking the questions that I think that need to be asked. And hopefully by the end, everybody will have access to gender affirming surgery, if we are successful at doing our jobs. No, I'm just joking. Yes, that of course is my dream. So with that, I will wrap up and say thank you so much again. And I can't wait to meet you in person.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk. And I'm also excited to go to US Path with you and see what is up there.
Thanks so much to Elijah for that interview. For folks on social media, you can follow along on my stories as I post updates from the conference there at jessicawilson.msrd. And thanks to those who reached out to let me know you'll be at the conference as well, and that you have your own awkward stories to tell me. If people want to share questions or experiences for the series, you can email them to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com and let me know if you'd like to remain anonymous. Until next time, make it awkward. The best way to support the show is to follow, rate, and review. This has been an episode of Making It Awkward. I've been your host, Jessica Wilson. This podcast is sponsored by the Legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services, whose owner, my dad, is finally retired as of yesterday. It is a production of The Body Politic. It's edited and mixed by the wonderful Jen Jacobs.